Worldcomedue. Elite Children's Classics.
Little Lord Fauntleroy. Chapter 1. Mr. Havisham's Visit. Cedric's father, Captain Errol, died when Cedric was only a small boy, so he was brought up by his mother. Cedric was never lonely, however, because he had many good friends. Mr. Hobbs, the grocery man, was one of them. He liked to tell the boy about how the Americans fought the British in order to win their independence. One day, while the two were chatting as usual, Cedric's maid came into the store. She told the boy that he had a visitor. Cedric hurried home and found a tall gentleman in the parlor talking with his mother. As soon as Cedric entered the room, the gentleman said, "So, this is Lord Fauntleroy." The visitor was Mr. Havisham, the family lawyer from Dorincourt Castle. He had come all the way from England. Mr. Havisham told Cedric and his mother the following very strange story. Cedric's father was the youngest son of the Earl of Dorincourt. The Earl had 3 sons, but the 2 oldest, Bevis and Maurice, were dead. The youngest son had gone to America and had married an American girl. The Earl hated America and the Americans, so when he heard of Captain Errol's marriage to an American, he was very angry. He decided never to forgive his son, Errol. Captain Errol found a job in New York. There, Cedric was born. Now that the captain was dead, Cedric was going to be the future Earl of Dorincourt. After this long explanation, Mr. Havisham turned to Mrs. Errol and said, "There is a very unpleasant matter that I am obliged to tell you. When Lord Fauntleroy comes to England, he will live at Dorincourt Castle with the Earl, but he wants you to live separately at Court Lodge, near the castle." To this, Mrs. Errol only answered, "My husband was very fond of Dorincourt Castle. I am sure he will be very happy that Cedric is going to live there." Then she added, "I hope the Earl will love Cedric." Mr. Havisham thought of the ill-tempered old Earl. He wondered if the Earl would really love his grandson. Chapter 2. The Errols Get Ready to Leave for England. Mr. Havisham saw Cedric several more times at his home during the next few days. On one of those occasions, the boy said to him, "I don't know what an earl is. Would you mind explaining to me what an earl is?" "Generally," said Mr. Havisham, "when a man has done some outstanding service for the king, he is made an earl. Also, an earl has a lot of money." "Oh, that's a good thing to have," said Cedric. "I wish I had a lot of money." "Oh, do you? And what would you do with it?" "First, I would buy my mother all sorts of pretty things. Then there is the old apple woman. I would buy her a new tent. Then there is Dick. He's a bootblack. I would buy him some new clothes." Just at this moment, Mrs. Errol came into the room. She said to Mr. Havisham, I'm sorry. I had to leave you alone with Cedric. I had a long talk with my neighbor, Bridget. She is in great trouble because her husband, Michael, is sick, and they cannot pay the rent. Mr. Havisham took a large billfold out of his breast pocket and said, "When I left England, the Earl entrusted me with a large sum of money for Lord Fauntleroy." Mrs. Errol turned to Cedric and said, "Your grandfather is very rich and kind. Why don't you give some of this money to Bridget?" Cedric accepted the money from Mr. Havisham and said, "Oh, Bridget will be so happy to have this money." The day before his departure for England, Cedric came to Mr. Hobbs's store with a gold watch. Mr. Hobbs was deeply moved when he saw the farewell gift. The next day, all the trunks were taken to the steamer. Then, Cedric and his mother went to the harbor by carriage. They got on the big steamer. As Cedric leaned over the railing of the ship, he saw Dick pushing his way through the crowd. Dick rushed up to Cedric and said, "I've come to see you off, and I brought this for you." With that, he handed Cedric a red silk handkerchief. Cedric had barely enough time to say, "Thank you," when Dick was gone, and the steamer began moving. Chapter 3. In England. During their voyage, Cedric's mother told him that Dorincourt Castle was not to be her home. She would live separately in a house nearby called Court Lodge. 11 days after leaving New York, the ship reached Liverpool. From Liverpool, Cedric and his mother took a train. After a long ride, the train finally stopped at a station. There, Cedric was glad to see a familiar face, that of Mr. Havisham. He had come in his carriage to meet the boy and his mother. The three had another long ride in the carriage, and at last stopped at the gates of Court Lodge. The servants, who were lined up at the entrance, looked at the future Earl of Dorincourt. They felt sorry for the little boy because they knew what an ill-tempered old man the Earl was. The three got off the carriage and walked up to the house. It was a beautiful house with all kinds of flowers blooming in the garden. When they were inside, Mr. Havisham said to Cedric, "Your lordship is to stay here tonight. In the meantime, I shall go to the castle and inform the Earl of your arrival. Tomorrow, your lordship will go with me to the castle to meet the Earl." Then Mrs. Errol said to Mr. Havisham, "When you see the Earl, please tell him I am very grateful for this beautiful house. But please tell him I cannot accept the income he wants to give me. It would be like selling my boy to the Earl. Please also ask him not to tell Cedric why I must live separately at Court Lodge. He is too young to understand." "I will give him your messages," said Mr. Havisham. Late that evening, Mr. Havisham saw the Earl in his library. The Earl was a gray-haired old man with an ill-tempered face. He was sitting in front of the fire in an armchair. "Lord Fauntleroy and his mother are at Court Lodge," said Mr. Havisham. "I shall bring his lordship here tomorrow." "Well," said the Earl in a gruff voice, "what sort of boy is he? I don't care about the mother." "I don't know much about children," answered Mr. Havisham, "but I think he's a fine lad." Then he continued, "I have a message for you from Mrs. Errol." "I don't want any of her messages," said the Earl. But Mr. Havisham delivered the message anyway. He said, "Mrs. Earl prefers not to accept the income your lordship proposes to give her." When the Earl heard this, he was so angry he could not speak at all. Mr. Havisham opened his mouth again and said, "I have one more message from Mrs. Errol." "I don't want to hear it," the angry Earl shouted. But again, Mr. Havisham delivered it anyway. He said, "She asks you not to tell Lord Fauntleroy anything about the reason why you have separated them." "Do you mean to say that she has not told him the reason?" the Earl asked. "Not one word, your lordship," Mr. Havisham answered. Then he left. Chapter 4. At Dorincourt Castle. The next day, late in the afternoon, Cedric and Mr. Havisham left Court Lodge by carriage for Dorincourt Castle. The carriage passed through the great gates of the castle grounds. Presently, Cedric saw his grandfather's castle. It was a stately and beautiful castle, like a fairy king's palace. When the carriage drove up to the spacious entrance, the heavy doors were thrown open. Cedric saw many servants standing in rows. A few minutes after his arrival, Cedric was taken to the Earl's library. A servant opened the door and said, "Lord Fauntleroy, my lord." Cedric stepped into the library. A huge dog was lying on the carpet. He got up and came toward the boy. Cedric was not afraid at all. He put his hand on the dog's collar, and the boy, together with the dog, advanced further into the room. The Earl was seated in his armchair by the fire. His head was turned away. Then, for the first time, he looked in the direction of Cedric. What the Earl saw was a graceful, childish figure in a black velvet suit with a white collar. He had a handsome face, and his eyes met the Earl's with a warm, friendly feeling. "Are you the Earl?" said Cedric as he walked up to the man. "I'm your grandson." Then Cedric held out his hand, because he thought that was the polite thing to do. "I hope you are well," he said. Then he continued, "I am very glad to see you." The Earl shook hands with the boy, with a curious expression in his eyes. Then, telling the boy to take a chair, he said, "You are glad to see me? Why?" "Because I wanted to thank you for all you have done for Bridget and the apple woman and Dick." "Bridget? The apple woman? Dick?" echoed the Earl. Who are those people?
They are all the people for whom you gave me so much money, answered Cedric. Then it was time for dinner. Cedric got up from his chair and went to his grandfather's side. Would you like me to help you? He said. You can lean on me. Cedric handed the Earl his cane and helped him to stand up. The old man put his hand on the boy's little shoulder. It was not a great distance to the dining room, but when at last the Earl was seated in his chair, Cedric took out Dick's red silk handkerchief and wiped his forehead with it. They spoke very little during the meal. When it was over, the two returned to the library, the Earl leaning on Cedric's shoulder again. Cedric lay down on the rug in front of the fire. He was thinking about his mother. Then drowsiness came over him, and soon he was sound asleep on the rug. Chapter 5. The Earl and His Grandson. When Cedric opened his eyes the next morning, he found himself lying on a large bed in a beautiful bedroom. A woman stood beside the bed. She said her name was Dawson, and that she was to take care of him. The boy dressed quickly. After breakfast, Dawson took him to another room. This room was full of books and toys of all kinds. This looks like a boy's room, said Cedric. But whose toys and books are these? Why, yours, my lord, answered Dawson. Mine? But who gave them to me? Then he quickly added, Oh, I know. It's Grandpa. Cedric spent the whole morning playing with the wonderful toys. In the afternoon, the Earl sent for him. He went immediately to the library. Thank you so much for all those wonderful presents, said Cedric as soon as he entered the room.
I'm glad you like them, said the Earl.
There is one game which is a little bit like baseball, said the boy. I thought maybe we could play it together. Have you ever played baseball?
I'm afraid not, but you can show me how.
I'll get the game, cried Cedric, and he ran out of the library. When he returned with the game a few minutes later, he found the Earl speaking with a gentleman dressed in black. He was Mr. Mordaunt, the rector of the parish. Mr. Mordaunt had come to see the Earl about one of the tenants, Higgins. Higgins had been sick for some time and could not work. Thus, he could not pay the rent. Mr. Newick, the Earl's agent, had told Higgins that he and his wife and children must leave their house. When Mr. Mordaunt finished speaking, Cedric said, Why, it was the same with Bridget's husband. He was sick too, and couldn't pay the rent because he couldn't work. The whole family would have been thrown out of their house. It was my grandfather's money that saved them. Then he turned to the Earl and said, "You will do the same thing for Mr. Higgins, won't you?" For a while, the Earl looked puzzled. Then he said to Cedric, "What would you do in this case?" "I would write a letter to Mr. Newick and tell him Mr. Higgins and his family can stay in the house until he is well and is able to work again."
"Well," said the Earl, "why don't you write such a letter to Newick?"
"My letter won't do any good," said Cedric.
"Yes, it will,"
said the Earl. So Cedric wrote the letter, and Mr. Mordaunt took it to Mr. Newick. A few days later, the Earl asked for his carriage. He wanted to go for a ride with his grandson. They went to the top of a hill. From the hilltop, the surrounding country could be seen.
"All this land will be yours someday," the Earl said.
"And when will that be?" asked Cedric.
"When I am dead,"
answered the Earl. "Then I don't want it. I want you to live forever." After that, Cedric was silent for a long time, and the Earl said,
"What are you thinking about?"
"Does Mr. Newick know about all your tenants?" the boy suddenly asked.
"It's his business to know,"
said the Earl.
"Why do you ask?"
"Because when I visited my mother the other day, she told me about a place called Earl's Court. She said the houses at Earl's Court are very old and miserable. In wet weather, the rain comes in through the roof. The people are poor. The children are hungry. And when they get sick, they have no medicine and they just die. My mother visits the place with food, clothing, and money. But what she can do is so little. She was crying when she told me about those people. I promised her I would speak to you about them, because if you knew about them, you would surely do something to help them." Of course, the Earl knew about Earl's Court. He had heard about conditions there from both Mr. Newick and Mr. Mordaunt. But he hadn't done anything. Now, for the first time in his life, the Earl felt ashamed of himself. As soon as he returned to the castle, the Earl called Mr. Newick and told him to repair the miserable houses in Earl's Court. He told him they were not his orders, but those of his grandson. Many days went by. Then one day, Mr. Havisham came to Dorincourt Castle and asked to see the Earl immediately.
"Well, what is it?"
said the Earl when the lawyer appeared before him. Mr. Havisham looked worried and said, "It seems a certain woman has just arrived from America. She claims to be the widow of your lordship's eldest son, Bevis. She has brought a boy with her who she says is the true heir to Dorincourt Castle, the true Lord Fauntleroy. Her picture, with her son standing beside her, is in all the papers, both English and American. She asks for a meeting with your lordship. The Earl remained silent for a long time. Then he said firmly, "Her claim shall be contested." There was great excitement in America, too. Dick, the bootblack, had seen the picture of the woman and her son in one of the newspapers. Dick had immediately recognized them as Mina, the wife of his brother, Ben, and their son. He consulted Mr. Hobbs and Ben, and it was agreed that they should send a telegram to Mr. Havisham, and that all three, Mr. Hobbs, Dick, and Ben, should leave immediately for England. The three arrived in England just in time to be present at the meeting between the Earl and the woman who claimed to be the widow of Bevis. At Dorincourt Castle, the Earl was in the library, waiting for the woman and her son to be brought in by Mr. Havisham. Dick, Ben, and Mr. Hobbs were in the next room. As soon as the woman and her son came into the library, the three entered the room too. "Hello, Mina," said Ben. That was all he had to say. The impostor turned pale, grabbed her son's arm, and, without a word, rushed out of the room. The next day, for the first time, the Earl visited Mrs. Errol at Court Lodge with Cedric. After the preliminary greetings, the Earl said to Cedric, "Fauntleroy, ask your mother when she will be ready to come to Dorincourt Castle to live with us." "But," interrupted Mrs. Errol, "Cedric is not Lord Fauntleroy. I understand that the true heir to Dorincourt Castle has been found." "The woman was an impostor," said the Earl, putting his hand on Cedric's shoulder. He said, "This is Lord Fauntleroy." Then he briefly explained to her what had happened at the castle the day before. Cedric ran up to his mother and flung his arms around her neck. "Oh, you are coming to live with us," he cried. "To live with us forever." A few days later, it was Cedric's 8th birthday, and there was a big party at the castle. All the Earl's relatives were present. So were the people of Earl's Court, including Mr. Higgins and his family. Of course, Mr. Hobbs, Dick, and Ben were there too. During the party, Cedric was asked to make a speech. This is what he said as he stood between the Earl and his mother. "Thank you for coming to my birthday party. I'm glad I'm going to be an Earl. At first, I didn't want to be an Earl, but now I do. When I'm an Earl, I'm going to try my best to be just as good as my grandfather."